January 17, 1943. Western Pacific Ocean, 40 miles southeast of Truk Lagoon. The merchant vessel Taifuku Maru cut through black water under a moonless sky, her hold packed with aviation fuel, ammunition, and rice bound for the imperial garrison at Rabaul. On the bridge, Captain Yoshida Takeo kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, though he knew the real danger lay beneath the surface. The convoy had lost radio contact with its escort destroyers 2 hours earlier. Now the 5 cargo ships sailed alone through waters that Japanese sailors had begun calling Umi no Yami, the ocean darkness, where vessels simply vanished without warning, without wreckage, without survivors. At 03:47 hours, the lookout never saw the white wake. The torpedo struck amidships with a concussion that lifted the entire stern clear of the water. Within 90 seconds, the Taifuku Maru broke her back and began her final descent, taking with her 42 crewmen and enough supplies to sustain 3,000 soldiers for a month. 4 miles distant, USS Wahoo was already diving to 300 feet, her crew reloading torpedo tubes with mechanical precision, hunting for the next target in the convoy. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton would mark this as his 7th confirmed kill of the patrol. Before the sun rose, 2 more Japanese merchantmen would join the Taifuku Maru on the ocean floor. This was not an isolated incident. This was systematic destruction on a scale that would reshape the entire Pacific War, and in the process, generate a terror among Japanese naval personnel that transcended ordinary combat fear. By 1943, the mere possibility of American submarine presence was enough to alter Japanese naval operations, reroute convoy schedules, and infiltrate the nightmares of every sailor who served aboard the Empire's merchant fleet. The Japanese fear of American submarines did not emerge from superstition or propaganda. It grew from the mathematical certainty of death that American submariners delivered with relentless efficiency across 3 years of warfare. To understand why this fear surpassed even the dread of American carrier strikes or B-29 bomber raids, one must first comprehend what Japan's military strategy fundamentally required and how American submarines methodically destroyed that foundation. When Japan initiated hostilities in December 1941, the Imperial General Headquarters built its entire war plan around a simple geographic reality. Japan was an island nation utterly dependent on imported resources. The home islands produced virtually no petroleum, insufficient iron ore, inadequate bauxite for aluminum, and only a fraction of the food required to sustain its population. The Empire's conquests throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific were not exercises in territorial ambition alone. They were desperate attempts to secure the raw materials necessary for industrial survival. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice paddies of Indochina. These conquests meant nothing if their resources could not reach Japanese factories and ports. The entire Japanese war economy depended on maritime transportation. Every gallon of fuel oil that powered the combined fleet's battleships, every pound of bauxite that became aircraft aluminum, every bag of rice that fed the garrison troops scattered across 10,000 miles of conquered territory. All of it traveled by merchant ship across sea lanes that stretched from Borneo to Yokohama, from Singapore to Tokyo Bay. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. Military planners calculated they needed to maintain at least 3 million tons operational to sustain the Empire's war economy. They estimated normal operational losses and planned accordingly. They did not plan for American submarines. The United States Navy entered World War II with a submarine force of roughly 50 boats in the Pacific, a relatively modest number compared to Germany's U-boat fleet in the Atlantic. But American submarines possessed 3 critical advantages that would prove devastating. First, they were large fleet submarines designed for extended Pacific operations, with greater range, better habitability, and heavier torpedo loads than their adversaries. Second, they operated with increasingly sophisticated intelligence support, including code-breaking operations that often provided advanced knowledge of Japanese convoy routes and schedules. Third, and most critically, they hunted in an operational environment where the Imperial Japanese Navy had systematically neglected anti-submarine warfare in favor of preparing for decisive surface engagements. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by decades of studying and emulating Western battle fleet tactics, focused obsessively on the climactic surface engagement, where battleships and carriers would determine the war's outcome. Convoy protection, anti-submarine patrol, and merchant marine defense were considered secondary duties unworthy of the combined fleet's attention. Japan began the war with inadequate numbers of escort vessels, insufficient anti-submarine training, primitive sonar technology, and a cultural disdain within the Navy for defensive operations. The merchant marine itself operated under civilian control until 1942, with minimal coordination between commercial shipping and naval protection. This doctrinal blindness created a hunting ground of extraordinary vulnerability. American submarines found their targets sailing predictable routes, often without escort, occasionally without even zigzagging, maintaining radio transmissions that helped confirm their positions. In the war's first year, American submarine effectiveness was limited primarily by the criminal inadequacy of the Mark 14 torpedo, which suffered from depth control problems and defective magnetic exploders. But Japanese anti-submarine defenses were so weak that even with a torpedo failure rate exceeding 60%, American submarines still achieved a positive kill ratio. When the torpedo problems were finally resolved in late 1943, the slaughter began in earnest. For the Japanese merchant sailor, the psychological impact of submarine warfare operated on a level distinct from other combat threats. When American carrier aircraft attacked, a man could see his enemy. He could watch the dive bombers descend, trace the arc of bombs falling, hear the anti-aircraft guns firing in defense, feel that he was part of a battle where courage and skill might influence survival. When B-29s appeared over Japanese cities in 1944, civilians could see the bombers run for shelters, take some action however futile. But against submarines, there was nothing to see. Nothing to shoot at. No warning before the explosion. No battle to fight. Only the endless ocean that might conceal death at any moment. Petty Officer Mitsuru Yoshida, who survived the sinking of the cruiser Yahagi in 1945, later wrote about his earlier experience aboard merchant vessels. "We feared the submarines more than any other weapon, because they made us feel already dead before the attack came. Every voyage became a sentence of execution that might be carried out at any moment. The American bombers we could respect as warriors. The American battleships we could understand as instruments of naval power. But the submarines were invisible assassins that transformed the ocean itself into an enemy." This psychological dimension intensified as the war progressed, and Japanese sailors developed an increasingly accurate understanding of their survival odds. By 1944, merchant marine casualties exceeded 60%, meaning that statistically a sailor was more likely to die than survive the war. These were not odds that could be rationalized away through appeals to duty or honor. These were numbers that made every convoy departure feel like a funeral procession. The physical experience of submarine attack compounded the terror. A torpedo strike typically occurred without warning. The first indication of danger was the explosion itself, a massive concussion that could break a ship's keel, rupture fuel tanks, and compromise watertight integrity before anyone understood what was happening. Ships carrying aviation fuel or ammunition often exploded catastrophically, vaporizing crews in an instant. Those aboard vessels that sank more slowly faced different nightmares: flooding compartments, failing electrical systems, the disorienting tilt as the ship began listing, the desperate scramble for lifeboats that were often damaged or inaccessible. Survivors who made it into the water confronted new horrors. Japanese convoy doctrine typically prohibited ships from stopping to recover survivors, as any vessel that slowed became an easier target. American submarines, following their own doctrine against surfacing in enemy-controlled waters, rarely attempted rescues. Men who escaped the initial sinking often found themselves alone in the Pacific, watching their ship disappear beneath the waves while the rest of the convoy steamed away, sometimes close enough to see but impossibly distant for rescue. Some survived days in the water before dying of exposure, dehydration, or shark attack. Others were lost immediately in waters far from any shipping lane, their deaths unrecorded and their disappearances unexplained. The statistical reality reinforced the terror. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant vessels totaling roughly 700,000 tons. In 1943, that number increased to 335 ships totaling 1.5 million tons. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchantmen at a rate of nearly 500,000 tons per month. The combined fleet, despite belated efforts to organize convoy systems and increase escort production, could not stem the losses. For every American submarine lost, and the U.S. Navy lost 52, submarines during the Pacific War, Japanese shipping losses averaged tens of thousands of tons of desperately needed supplies. The Japanese military attempted to counter this threat through multiple strategies, each revealing both the seriousness with which they regarded submarine warfare and the fundamental inadequacy of their response. In 1943, the Imperial Navy established the Grand Escort Command Fleet specifically to organize convoy protection, but this effort came too late and with insufficient resources. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce escort vessels, sonar equipment, and depth charges on the scale required to protect thousands of miles of sea lanes. The escort vessels that were produced often proved ineffective against American submarine tactics. American submarine commanders developed sophisticated approaches that exploited Japanese defensive weaknesses. Rather than attacking convoys head-on against concentrated escort protection, submarines began using wolf pack tactics similar to those employed by German U-boats in the Atlantic. Multiple submarines would coordinate attacks on a single convoy, with one boat drawing off escorts while others struck unprotected merchantmen. American submarines also learned to attack at night on the surface, where their low profile made them nearly impossible to detect visually. Their superior radar allowed them to track targets in complete darkness, and their diesel engines gave them speed advantages over many Japanese escorts. The technical sophistication gap widened as the war progressed. By 1944, American submarines routinely carried radar, systems that allowed them to detect targets at ranges exceeding 20 miles, distances at which Japanese lookouts had no chance of spotting a submarine's periscope or wake. American submarines also benefited from improving torpedo technology, better fire control systems, and increasingly detailed intelligence about Japanese convoy routes and schedules derived from signals intelligence operations. Japanese countermeasures proved largely futile. Sonar systems remained primitive and unreliable. Depth charge patterns were often predictable and easily evaded by submarines diving beyond 300 feet, depths that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine assumed were unreachable but which American fleet submarines routinely operated at. Air patrols, hampered by aircraft shortages and inadequate training for anti-submarine operations, rarely detected submarines and almost never achieved kills. The ocean itself conspired against Japanese efforts, as the Pacific's depth and vastness provided American submarines with an operating environment where detection was extraordinarily difficult and evasion relatively straightforward. Perhaps most damaging was the institutional failure to prioritize anti-submarine warfare within the Japanese naval establishment. Even as merchant shipping losses mounted to catastrophic levels, the combined fleet continued to regard convoy escort duty as inglorious work, unworthy of first-line vessels and elite personnel. Destroyer captains assigned to escort duty often treated it as punishment, rather than vital service. Training for anti-submarine operations remained inadequate throughout the war. The rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture made it difficult for junior officers who understood the submarine threat to influence doctrine or resource allocation. Captain Atsushi Oi, who served with the Grand Escort Command Fleet, later wrote with bitter clarity about these failures. "We understood the submarine problem intellectually but never emotionally. Our hearts remained focused on the decisive battle doctrine, on surface engagements that would never come, while American submarines methodically strangled our empire. By the time our leadership truly recognized that the war would be lost not in battleship duels, but in the slow destruction of our merchant fleet, it was far too late to build the escorts, train the crews, and develop the tactics that might have saved us." The material consequences of American submarine warfare extended far beyond simple shipping tonnage calculations. Every merchant vessel that failed to reach port represented not just lost cargo but cascading failures throughout Japan's war economy. A tanker sunk en route from Borneo meant that Japanese aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. A freighter lost while carrying bauxite meant reduced aluminum production and fewer aircraft manufactured. A transport vessel destroyed while loaded with rice meant garrison troops in the Pacific subsisting on quarter rations, their combat effectiveness degrading through malnutrition. By 1944, these cumulative losses had created an economic catastrophe. Japanese civilian food consumption had declined by 30% compared to pre-war levels. Industrial production was hamstrung by raw material shortages. The combined fleet, ironically, found itself increasingly immobilized not by American naval action but by fuel shortages. Battleships and carriers sat at anchor because there was insufficient bunker oil to sortie them. The Empire's defensive perimeter, stretched across the Pacific, began withering as isolated garrisons received neither reinforcements nor resupply. Soldiers starved on islands where jungle and sea provided insufficient food. Aircraft rusted on airfields that never received replacement parts or ammunition. The human cost among Japanese merchant mariners reached genocidal proportions. Of approximately 122,000 Japanese merchant sailors who served during the war, roughly 60,000 died, a casualty rate exceeding that of any other service, including kamikaze pilots. Entire training classes of merchant marine cadets were virtually annihilated. Ships that survived one voyage and returned to port found it increasingly difficult to recruit replacement crews, as sailors who understood the statistics became understandably reluctant to sign aboard vessels that had become floating coffins. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to maintain morale through propaganda, emphasizing duty and sacrifice, but propaganda could not overcome mathematical reality. By late 1944, merchant sailors boarding ships for convoy duty knew they were unlikely to survive the war. Some went through Shinto purification rituals before departure, preparing for death rather than return. Others simply deserted, accepting the shame of abandonment rather than the certainty of drowning in the Pacific. The Merchant Marines' collapse as a functional service began, not with the destruction of all ships but with the erosion of will among men who could no longer convince themselves that courage and skill might influence survival. American submariners, for their part, operated with remarkable efficiency and equally remarkable ignorance of the broader strategic impact they were achieving. Individual submarine commanders understood they were sinking enemy shipping and disrupting Japanese logistics, but few comprehended the extent to which their accumulated actions were systematically destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. The submarine force operated as a distributed weapon system, with dozens of boats patrolling independently across the Pacific, each achieving modest individual results that aggregated into strategic devastation. Life aboard American submarines involved its own hardships and terrors. Submarines operated in hostile waters thousands of miles from friendly ports, often remaining submerged for extended periods in cramped conditions, breathing recycled air that grew increasingly foul, enduring depth charge attacks that could crush a hull or rupture batteries releasing chlorine gas. American submarine casualties, while far lower than Japanese merchant marine losses, still reached approximately 3,500 dead, roughly 22% of the men who served in the submarine force, making it the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. But American submariners fought with advantages that fundamentally altered their combat effectiveness. They served aboard boats with superior engineering, better habitability, and greater reliability than their Japanese counterparts. They received excellent training that emphasized both technical proficiency and tactical innovation. They operated with intelligence support that often provided advance warning of target locations. Perhaps most importantly, they fought as part of a military system that valued their contribution and continuously worked to improve their effectiveness through better torpedoes, superior radar, and refined tactics. The contrast with Japanese submariners proved stark. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated a substantial submarine force, but Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized fleet support operations and attacks on enemy warships rather than commerce raiding. Japanese submarines scored some notable successes, including the sinking of several American aircraft carriers early in the war. But they never systematically targeted American merchant shipping in the way American submarines hunted Japanese merchantmen. This represented a fundamental doctrinal failure that persisted throughout the war, even as American submarines demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of commerce warfare. The divergent approaches reflected broader cultural and strategic differences. American submariners saw themselves as part of an integrated campaign to strangle Japanese logistics and war production. Japanese submariners remained focused on the decisive battle doctrine, seeking glory through attacks on enemy capital ships rather than inglorious sinkings of cargo vessels. When American submarines encountered Japanese freighters, they attacked without hesitation. When Japanese submarines encountered American merchant ships, they often ignored them in favor of hunting for warships, a choice that had minimal strategic impact compared to the systematic destruction of Japan's maritime supply lines. By early 1945, the cumulative effect of submarine warfare had reduced Japanese merchant shipping to roughly 10% of its pre-war capacity. The empire's economy had entered terminal collapse. Cities starved while rural areas hoarded rice. Factories closed for lack of raw materials. The home islands, isolated by American submarine blockade as effectively as by surface fleet action, could no longer sustain the war effort. Japanese military planners preparing for the anticipated American invasion calculated that civilian food reserves would be exhausted within months, guaranteeing mass starvation regardless of battlefield outcomes. The fear that Japanese sailors had developed toward American submarines had metastasized into a broader recognition throughout Japanese military and civilian leadership that the submarine campaign had accomplished what carrier strikes and battleship bombardments could not: the complete severing of Japan's maritime lifelines. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, he cited multiple factors including atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war, but the strategic reality underlying his decision included the inescapable fact that Japan could no longer feed its population or fuel its military because American submarines had transformed the Pacific Ocean from a highway into an impassable barrier. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping remained relatively unknown to the American public during and immediately after the war. Unlike carrier battles or amphibious invasions, submarine operations produced few dramatic photographs or eyewitness accounts accessible to journalists. The submarine force operated in secrecy, often filing reports only after returning to port weeks after engagements. Strategic bombing campaigns received far more attention, despite achieving more limited results until the final months of war. But post-war analysis by military historians and strategists revealed that the submarine campaign had been perhaps the single most cost-effective American military operation of the entire Pacific, or Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force from 1943 through war's end, later summarized the campaign's achievements. American submarines comprised less than 2% of U.S. naval forces, but accounted for 55% of all Japanese shipping destroyed. They sank 1,114 enemy merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons, plus 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They accomplished this at a cost of 52 submarines and 3,500 men. No other weapon system in any theater of any war has achieved such a disproportionate strategic impact relative to resources invested. These statistics, however precise, cannot capture the human experience they represent. Thousands of Japanese sailors dying in darkness beneath the Pacific. American submariners enduring depth charge attacks that shook their boats like toys. The cascading collapse of an entire economy as ships vanished from sea lanes. The numbers document destruction but obscure the terror that permeated every convoy departure. Every watch standing, every moment of wondering whether the next minute would bring the torpedo that ended everything. The Japanese fear of American submarines thus emerged not from irrational panic but from accurate assessment of mortal danger. Unlike fears based on propaganda or rumor, this fear grew from direct experience and verifiable casualty rates. Japanese sailors who survived submarine attacks carried that experience back to port, where their testimony educated others about what awaited them. By 1944, virtually every merchant sailor had lost friends or comrades to submarine action. The fear became self-reinforcing as losses mounted and survival odds declined. This fear manifested in ways that further degraded Japanese operational effectiveness. Convoy routes grew increasingly circuitous as planners attempted to avoid known submarine patrol areas, lengthening voyage times and reducing shipping efficiency. Ships traveled at suboptimal speeds to conserve fuel, making them easier targets. Some vessels remained in port rather than risk dangerous waters, creating supply bottlenecks even when ships were available. The psychological impact of submarine warfare thus compounded its material effects, degrading Japanese logistics not just through ships destroyed but through shipping capacity underutilized due to fear. The symbolism of the submarine threat resonated throughout Japanese military culture in ways that other dangers did not. Carrier aircraft, devastating as they were, represented conventional military power, a threat that could be understood within traditional frameworks of naval warfare. B-29 bombers, despite their unprecedented destructiveness, remained within the comprehension of aerial bombardment doctrine that had existed since World War I. But submarines embodied something more insidious, an invisible enemy that struck without warning, that could not be fought or even seen, that transformed the ocean itself from neutral medium into hostile environment. Japanese propaganda attempted to counter this perception by portraying American submariners as cowardly assassins who avoided honorable surface combats. But this framing backfired by implicitly acknowledging submarine effectiveness. Calling the enemy cowardly did not make convoys safer or reduce casualties. Moreover, Japanese sailors recognized that tactical cowardice and strategic effectiveness were entirely separate considerations. An enemy might be dishonorable and still win the war. By late 1944, many Japanese merchant sailors had concluded that honor was a luxury for those not drowning in darkness. The comparison with other threats illuminates why submarines generated such disproportionate fear. American carrier strikes, while devastating to Japanese naval and air forces, were episodic events, periods of intense combat followed by periods of relative calm. B-29 raids, though increasingly destructive by 1945, targeted primarily industrial and urban areas rather than randomly selecting victims from across the entire military establishment. But submarine warfare was continuous and omnipresent. Every convoy faced submarine threat. Every voyage might end in torpedo explosion. There was no safe season, no guaranteed route, no tactical doctrine that ensured survival. This omnipresence created what modern psychologists would recognize as chronic threat stress, the persistent activation of fear responses without relief or resolution. Unlike acute combat stress that spiked during battle and diminished afterward, submarine threat stress maintained constant pressure throughout every voyage. Japanese merchant sailors could never truly relax, never convince themselves they had escaped danger. Even within sight of port, submarines still lurked. Even after surviving one convoy, the next departure began the cycle anew. The final months of war demonstrated how thoroughly submarine warfare had achieved its strategic objectives. By summer 1945, American submarines had largely shifted focus from merchant shipping to Japanese warships and coastal targets, not from mercy, but because so few merchant vessels remained operational that finding targets had become difficult. The Japanese merchant marine effectively ceased to exist as a functional service. The few vessels still attempting cargo runs sailed primarily in coastal waters close to shore, accepting reduced efficiency and cargo capacity in exchange for reduced submarine exposure. The home islands existed in a state of siege more complete than any medieval castle blockade. Food, fuel, and raw materials simply could not reach Japanese ports in quantities necessary to sustain war production or civilian consumption. The empire that had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific could not feed its own people because the maritime arteries that connected island to empire had been severed. American submarines had achieved what centuries of Japanese insularity had always feared: complete isolation from the Asian mainland and its resources. When Japanese officials discussed surrender terms in July and August 1945, the submarine blockade formed part of the inescapable calculus. Continuing the war meant certain starvation for millions of Japanese civilians within months. The atomic bombings and Soviet invasion provided immediate catalysts for surrender, but the underlying strategic hopelessness derived substantially from the maritime isolation that submarines had created. Japan could not win, could not achieve stalemate, could not even prolong the war indefinitely because the submarine campaign had already determined the outcome. Petty Officer Yoshida, who survived to write his memoirs in the 1950s, reflected on this reality with clarity. The American submarines defeated us long before the atomic bombs fell. They defeated us silently, invisibly, without the drama of great battles or the glory of decisive victories. They defeated us by making the ocean impassable, by making every voyage a journey toward death, by destroying not just ships but our capacity to believe we could survive. When the Emperor announced surrender, many of us felt relief rather than shame, because we understood that the submarines had already won the war. We were simply acknowledging what the ocean had already decided. The legacy of the submarine campaign against Japan extended far beyond 1945 post-war. Naval doctrine across all maritime nations recognized submarine warfare as a potentially decisive strategic weapon, not merely a tactical harassment tool. The success of American submarines validated commerce raiding as legitimate strategy and demonstrated that relatively small numbers of submarines could achieve effects disproportionate to their size or cost. The Soviet Navy, studying American success, built the world's largest submarine force as a centerpiece of Cold War naval strategy. Modern naval planning continues to recognize submarine-launched attacks on merchant shipping as an existential threat to any island nation dependent on maritime trade. For Japan, the submarine campaign remained a traumatic national memory that influenced post-war maritime policy. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force developed sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities that reflected hard lessons learned through bitter experience. Japanese merchant marine training incorporated extensive coverage of submarine threat awareness and survival techniques. The cultural memory of merchant sailors dying by tens of thousands in submarine attacks persisted in literature, film, and oral histories, a reminder of vulnerability that shaped Japanese security consciousness for generations. The merchant sailors who survived carried their memories privately, often reluctant to discuss experiences that remained too painful for casual conversation. Those who did speak described not just physical horror but psychological isolation, the loneliness of fearing what others could not see, of trying to explain terror without adequate vocabulary, of surviving when so many comrades had not. The survivors knew they had endured something that transcended ordinary combat experience, a type of warfare that struck not at enemy combatants but at the invisible infrastructure sustaining war itself. The question remains why submarines generated such disproportionate fear compared to equally lethal threats. The answer lies partly in human psychology's response to invisible dangers. Threats we can perceive and understand, even if lethal, generate less existential anxiety than dangers beyond our sensory awareness. Japanese sailors could watch American aircraft approach, track their bomb runs, see explosions, understand cause and effect. But submarine attacks offered none of this cognitive framework. The torpedo simply appeared, the explosion occurred, the ship died, all without apparent cause or warning. This unpredictability undermined the psychological defenses that allow soldiers to function under combat stress. Military training emphasizes that courage, skill, and discipline improve survival odds, a belief that makes combat psychologically tolerable, even when statistically dangerous. But submarine warfare largely negated these factors. Courage did not prevent torpedoes. Skill could not detect submerged submarines. Discipline offered no defense against invisible enemies. The compact that allows soldiers to accept mortal danger, the promise that their actions might influence survival, dissolved beneath the Pacific. The fear also reflected accurate risk assessment rather than irrational panic. By 1944, a Japanese merchant sailor faced better than even odds of dying before war's end, probabilities that exceeded those facing infantrymen in frontline combat. This was not paranoia, but mathematics. The sailors who felt terrified were responding rationally to genuine mortal danger. Their fear represented sanity asserting itself against a military system that demanded they continue accepting unacceptable risks. The totality of submarine warfare's impact on Japanese logistics created additional psychological pressure. Merchant sailors understood they were not simply combatants but economic actors, whose survival directly affected Japan's capacity to continue fighting. When their ship sank, it represented not just personal loss but contribution to national collapse. This dual burden, personal survival and collective responsibility, amplified stress beyond normal combat psychology. In the war's aftermath, American submarine veterans rarely discussed their achievements in triumphalist terms. They had fought effectively, achieved remarkable results, and contributed decisively to Allied victory. But they had also participated in warfare whose impersonal mechanics troubled some of them. They had sunk merchant vessels knowing they condemned sailors to drowning deaths. They had left survivors floating in darkness, following tactical doctrine that prohibited surface rescues, but understanding the human cost. They had fought efficiently and won decisively, yet some carried memories that resisted simple patriotic narratives. Japanese survivors, conversely, struggled with the inverse burden, having endured overwhelming defeat in a campaign where courage and sacrifice proved strategically meaningless. They had watched friends die, felt terror that transcended warrior ideals, survived through chance rather than virtue. The Bushido code that suffused Japanese military culture offered no framework for processing this experience. There was no honor in drowning, no glory in random death, no redemption in survival through luck. The submarine war had made a mockery of martial ideals, reducing combat to industrial process where submarines processed targets, and men died without meaning. The strategic historians who studied the campaign found themselves documenting a particularly modern form of warfare: systematic, efficient, impersonal, decisive. The submarine campaign represented industrialized combat at its most refined, sophisticated technology applied through careful planning to achieve measurable strategic objectives. It validated doctrines of economic warfare that targeted not enemy soldiers but the logistical foundations supporting them. It demonstrated that wars could be won not through climactic battles but through patient strangulation of supply lines. Yet this historical vindication could not erase the human cost it documented. 60,000 Japanese merchant sailors dead, 3,500 American submariners killed, thousands more physically and psychologically scarred. The efficiency that made the campaign strategically successful also made it humanly terrible. The same characteristics that allowed submarines to win the economic war, invisibility, surprise, systematic targeting, also maximized psychological trauma for those who faced them. The ocean today passes above the wrecks of those 1,214 Japanese merchant vessels, their hulls resting on Pacific seabeds from the Philippines to the Marianas, from the South China Sea to the waters off the home islands. The ships lie as they fell, some broken by internal explosions, others intact but flooded, many scattered across debris fields that mark their final death throes. The men who went down with them remain there still, their names recorded in Japanese merchant marine casualty lists, their families long since conducting memorial services over empty graves. These wrecks constitute a monument to warfare's evolution, marking the transformation of submarines from experimental curiosities into decisive strategic weapons. They document the moment when maritime commerce raiding achieved industrial scale and strategic impact. They represent the point where invisible threats became more fearsome than visible enemies, where economic warfare proved more destructive than traditional combat. The fear those wrecks generated among Japanese sailors was neither cowardice nor irrationality. It was the appropriate response to accurate assessment of mortal danger, the psychological recognition that survival had become improbable. The terror was warranted because the threat was real, immediate, and effectively uncounterable. Japanese sailors feared American submarines more than any other threat because American submarines were, in fact, the most lethal threat they faced, not in any single engagement but across the accumulated statistics of 3 years' warfare. The submarine campaign succeeded not just through technical superiority or tactical excellence, though both mattered. It succeeded because it struck at vulnerability rather than strength, because it targeted the invisible logistics supporting Japan's war effort rather than the visible military forces defending it. It succeeded because it was patient, systematic, and relentless, qualities that made it strategically effective and psychologically devastating. The symbolism embedded in submarine warfare transcended the specific tactics and technologies. Submarines represented a particular form of American industrial power, sophisticated, technologically advanced, efficiently applied toward clear strategic objectives. They embodied warfare as engineering problem, combat as industrial process, victory as accumulation of quantifiable metrics. This approach would define American military methods throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. On quiet nights, in survivors' memories and historians' accounts, the fear remains palpable across 80 years' distance. The fear of hearing nothing, seeing nothing, knowing nothing until the torpedo struck. The fear of watching the ocean consume comrades while helpless to save them. The fear of returning to port only to board another ship for another convoy into the same darkness. The fear of mathematical certainty, that the ocean had become an abattoir, that ships were coffins, that every voyage might be final. They could not be defeated by courage or skill, only survived through luck that ran out for 60% of those who faced them. The submarine war was fought in darkness, beneath waves, beyond observation. It unfolded without dramatic photographs or memorable battles, without heroes' names familiar to general audiences. But it achieved what more visible campaigns could not: the systematic destruction of Japan's capacity to wage war, the severing of every maritime artery that connected island to empire, the transformation of an ocean into a graveyard. The fear was justified. The threat was real. The ocean remembers what happened there, even if the world has largely forgotten. And somewhere in the deep Pacific, the wrecks remain, silent monuments to the sailors who died not in glory but in darkness, not in battle but in drowning, not through honorable combat, but through systematic industrial slaughter that reshaped naval warfare forever. The submarines won. The sailors died. The ocean kept their secrets. And the fear, documented in casualty lists and survivor testimony, justified by statistical inevitability and strategic devastation, remains the appropriate response to accurate understanding of what happened beneath those Pacific waters between 1942 and 1945, where invisible enemies hunted relentlessly, where courage proved meaningless against mathematics, and where the ocean itself became complicit in victory achieved through silent, patient, systematic death.